So today I'm talking about a Honda with the check battery sensor error message on the dashboard, what it is and how you go about fixing it. So what is this Honda check battery sensor error message? Well, the onboard computer uses a sensor to measure how many amps is flowing through the battery charging system, and it uses this for different reasons. It can use this to help increase how much output the alternator is putting out, and it also can use this sensor to see if the system's working. And it's seeing an error with this, so it has to be troubleshooted to know why. So some of the possible causes, well, it could be an alternator, it could be the battery, could be the battery terminals, it could be the battery current sensor, and it could be a fuse. And so the first thing to do when you get this is to go examine the engine compartment fuse box. Now every Honda is a little different on how they label this fuse that goes through this sensor, and there's usually just one fuse box, but sometimes there could be two. So you pop the hood, and inside the engine compartment there'll be a fuse box. And for example here, this is a 2016 Honda HR-V, and right here it says battery sensor, so it'll be fuse 3. It's a 10 amp fuse. It says battery sensor. That would be the fuse that goes to it on this particular Honda. Here's an example of a 2011 Honda Odyssey, and it's labeled battery management system, and it'll be fuse 8. It'll be a 7.5 amp fuse on the number 8 fuse in the engine compartment. And here's a Honda just labeled battery sensor, and it's labeled AMS. So like I said, these could be labeled a little differently, but the first thing to do is to go and locate this sensor. So right here, this one, it's labeled BMS or battery management system. It'll be the 7.5 amp fuse. You also have a larger fuse over here, but if the larger fuse blows for the battery system, nothing would power on. So you want this smaller fuse, the battery management system, 7.5 amp on this particular one. And so you get in the fuse box, and what you want to do is you want to just check and be sure that fuse hasn't blown. If it has blown, then try to replace it, and hopefully it doesn't blow again. If it does blow after you replace it, then very likely there's electrical short somewhere or something. So it'd have to be troubleshooted more, but the first thing to do is to check for a blown fuse. And so if you check for a blown fuse and there's no blown fuse and that all looks good, then the next thing to go and check is going to be the sensor. And the battery current sensor can be located differently depending on the Honda, but they're usually located up on top of the battery on the negative power terminal. And so again, you might have to Google it, but in this example right here, the battery current sensor is on the negative terminal. It has a power plug going into it. So what you could do, you go examine this power plug, check out this sensor, and be sure that it all looks good and everything looks plugged in. And so the way you go about testing these is you measure the output of the alternator, and if it's putting out good voltage and the battery tests good, then very likely that sensor is failed. And so the way you go about testing the alternator and the battery is first check the battery. Be sure it's holding the charge. You want it to be at least over 12 volts, usually like at least 12.04, 12.05 or greater. So like in this image it's 12.64. That'd be perfect. That'd be a good charge battery. If it's below 12 volts, if it's like 11.94 or something along these lines, then the battery is going to need to be charged to see if it holds a charge. So you take a battery charger, you charge it for like at least half an hour to an hour, and then you check it again and see if it's holding the charge. If you don't have a battery charger, you could take it to an auto parts store. They'll test it for free. They'll charge it and test it for free. But the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure the battery's good. And keep in mind, if the alternator's not working, it might have drained the battery. So the battery might be good and just need a charge if the alternator's gone bad, which would be the next thing to check. So the next thing to do is to start the engine and check to see if the voltage increases, because the alternator should be putting out roughly 13.5 to 14.5 volts. It can vary on the Honda and the alternator output specifications, but 13.5 to 14.5 volts, that's roughly where they're usually at. If it's going really high, if it's going over like 16 volts, then that's overcharging. But if it's not going up at all, if it's staying around 12 volts, then there's something wrong with the alternator output. And so if you start the vehicle up and the voltage doesn't increase, it doesn't go up to like at least 13.5 volts, then you're going to want to go check out the alternator and get it tested. If you can remove it from the vehicle, you could take it to an auto parts store. They'll test it for free. And then if it's bad, you can just get a replacement. But if you're not getting like at least 13.5 volts output coming out of it, then very likely there's some kind of issue going on there with the alternator. And one thing to be sure to check is be sure to check the belt tensioner and all this going around, because if it's not spinning good, then it could be causing an issue if the belt's weak or something like that. So be sure that belt's on there good and that tensioner is holding it on. And so if you start up the vehicle and the voltage does go up, it's like at least 13.5 to 14.5 volts, something along those lines, then very likely that current sensor has gone bad. And at this point, it would be best just to go ahead and replace it. I'm going to jump over on Amazon and I'll give you an idea how much they cost. It looks like they're ranging around $30, $40. So they're not high cost parts or nothing. But at this point, it would be best just to go ahead and swap out that battery current sensor. And so what do you do if you get the Honda check battery sensor message? Well, first thing to do, check for a blown fuse. It can be labeled differently, so you'll have to Google it to find out. They're usually labeled like battery management system, AMS or BMS, something like that. They'll be inside the engine fuse box. The fuse all looks good, there's no blown fuse. Then check the alternator output with the multimeter. Be sure it's at least 13.5 volts. You can Google what your particular year of Honda and alternator alternator output's supposed to be so that you get a closer idea of what it's supposed to be outputting, but it should be at least 13.5 volts. Otherwise, it very likely is an issue. If you're not getting that voltage, then take the alternator out and go get it tested, because very likely it's failed. But if you are getting at least 13.5 volts, then the alternator's working and very likely the current sensor has gone bad. Go ahead and replace the current sensor and that should solve the issue. And so that's basically it. I just wanted to give a real quick brief overview of what's going on with the Honda check battery sensor message and how you go about fixing it. If you have anything to add, please comment down below. If you have any questions, ask me and I'll try to answer them. If this video helps you, please click like, please click subscribe, and have a good day.